good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on what part of the world you are, um, depending on what part of the world you live in. David and I have known each other for, David Millett and I have known each other for a host of years, probably more than he wants to acknowledge. But so we come to this webinar with the decided objective of trying to answer questions that you have, of trying to have a conversation about what we've seen over the course of our many years in testing, particularly in testing SAP. We've both been in the testing space for a number of years, have developed and tests for custom dev apps and other packaged application apps, but today we're particularly focused on SAP. So as an agenda, and hopefully at the end of the conversation, you will have an understanding of just how impact analysis can help you change your testing approach, how it identifies both relevant test assets and, more importantly, identifies gaps in coverage. In the SAP space, and David, feel free to chime in at any point in time. In the SAP space, we often see the testing task pushed out to the user community, and with the mandate to test what you use. For those of us who have lived in the discipline of quality and the discipline of testing, that's not a particularly accurate way to accomplish the problem set. So we're going to talk a little bit about creating updates for appropriate test sets and data, how we validate those test assets before they're going into production, and how do you do automation when that's part of the key issue. Are there other things that, if there are other things you would like to see us cover today in this general range of topics, please enter them into the chat so we know about them and can be sure we address them during the conversation. It's been interesting in the QA business and the testing business of SAP. In the mid-90s, when most of the companies in the US were making decisions on the acquisition of SAP as their ERP platform and looking at how they go forward to that, how they go forward with those deployments, there was a huge amount of testing. In fact, David was at Mercury Interactive at the time. Mercury Interactive was the kind of go-to test planning, test management solution in both load testing and functional testing at that point in time. And so so it was not uncommon at all for the systems integrators who were supporting those deployments to invoke and utilize automated testing and doing testing of SAP. As we progressed through the 2000s and those implementations were completed and we're now moving more into a further deployment and maintenance mode, a set of things began to occur. One is testing. QA organizations were often downsized, with organizations, end-user organizations, striving to reduce their cost of testing as they're going forward. The complexity of SAP was beginning to be understood much better. One of the things that we all know is that if you're in an SAP environment, change is constant. These applications have been deployed for, 10, 15, 20 plus years, and they are changing at the same rate of speed today as they were often 10 years ago or when they were deployed. So you have constant change. We've tried to solve the problem with automated testing. We've tried to have the users do do more manual testing, and there is an overriding in the majority of companies that I see. There is an overriding lack of comprehensive requirements. Dave, do you see a similar thing in the clients that you work with?
Oh, absolutely. You know, having been at SAP and Mercury and HP and you know seen this evolution, this complexity of these packaged applications and the division, the I guess the gap that happens between the technical experts that understand automation and the actual business logic that needs to be tested in the data is something that we see more and more of. That complexity in these specific areas is probably one of the most complex elements to tackle and challenge within organizations.
And so we see a continued set of challenges in this marketplace. Uh, you know, QA resources continue to diminish. Requirements are, you know, continue to be non-existent and not updated, and there's not particularly anyone who's showing up with some set of magic to define requirements today. Every go live, I don't think I've ever in my career worked with a packaged application where there is a name for the period after I go live, because the incident rate is so high. SAP SAP has turned this into a benefit statement called hypercare, but at the end of the day, the reality is companies go live with their software, with their SAP applications, with modifications to their changes, and I'm sure, as you well know, a typical SAP lifecycle in a company is kind of a major new set of functionality gets deployed once a year, and a major set of updates get deployed once a year. So you have, and every 6 months, and some companies are going to quarterly releases, and now some SAP customers are trying to get to monthly releases. And so this problem of what do you test, how do you test it, and and at the end of the day, the only real objective for all the testing is to ensure that the defect rate is going down over time and improving. So I think that's the dilemma that we see. And just, you know, because the numbers, if you are moving from ECC6, let's even say support pack or enhancement pack 5, which is very current, to the new current, which is EHP 7, there are, you can see the numbers here, huge numbers. Support packs, 4 million objects that are going to be affected. And the questions, what will be impacted? Do we have the right test coverage? What are their test gaps? Dave, do you see any other questions and kind of those essential set of questions that the customer's trying to answer as it relates to testing?
Well, I mean, I think the most compelling question that any organization is facing when they're getting ready to deploy, you know, a major change like this, you know, changes put into a system to basically allow them to enhance functionality. The reason people push back these changes is because of the incomprehension of the risk that it can pose to the business, right? Because these systems like SAP are so critical to driving the day-to-day operations in the business, the biggest question is how will this potentially impact my system? What are the potential risk areas that could cause my business to have disruption, right? So all of these answers basically tie into that one major question, which is, you know, what is the potential disruption to my business? And we want answers to those questions so that we can actually properly test and validate and ensure that we're not going to have any negative impact to it.
And so just to elaborate one more time on I think virtually everyone knows the T code VA01. If you've been around SAP for more than 15 minutes, you know VA01. SAP is in large part an object-oriented structure. About over time grown to an object-oriented language, and a number of the other things are take on object-oriented characteristics. Well, what that does is create n-level linkages that could affect your specific T code. So in the case of create sales order, there are virtually 19,000, not virtually, there are in fact 19,000 and only a level 2 depth changes that could be made to the SAP system that would impact VA01. With impact analysis, what are you trying to do? You're really trying to define just the changed objects, just the affected objects. And most of this is you're focused around your custom code, because in most of the SAP shops, it's not uncommon to have 25–30% of the business process be custom code sets of activity. And with impact analysis, you get down to the specific object that is being changed and the screen that is impacted. So if you're running automation, you can specifically identify that test asset and that automated test. If you're doing manual testing, you can identify at the program T-code level program name, because most manual tests haven't captured screen identity. You can identify those T-codes that need to be tested. David, do you think this gives us an ability to much better focus our testing?
Oh, absolutely. Because if you don't understand what's changing within a system, and you tackle testing for a system such as SAP with the breadth of what it covers and the amount of movable parts that are inside of that, you could literally embark on a project that could be never ending of trying to test everything. So understanding what are the custom areas that are being impacted and understanding how the transports are going to impact your target system allows you to much more efficiently prioritize and create a more realistic roadmap to test out everything that matters and mitigate the risk of deploying these changes into production, which, let's face it, we want to deploy these changes into production. We're maintenance paying customers of SAP, paying significant dollars to SAP to gain access to something that's supposed to give us an edge. If we're stuck in a world where we can't deploy that change because of the fear that we have around it, we're basically spending a lot of money for something that's not something that we could move or benefit from. So understanding these elements and gaining a depth of visibility into what's changing and how it impacts things, and allowing us to determine what we need to test is critical to allow us to gain control of our SAP landscape and be much more efficient in deploying the change and the transports into that system, and therefore benefiting from the enhancements that are brought forward into the core SAP system when we deploy those transports.
And I think, Dave, one of the things that we are seeing in the SAP market, if we looked a few years ago, every project in SAP was really a waterfall project, waterfall development and test project. And so the projects were fairly large in scope. They ran over a fairly long period of time, and testing, the biggest problem with testing in those projects was the go live date never changed, but the time that development turned the system over to QA so you could actually do testing always seemed to shrink. It wasn't that the development was taking longer and so the go live date got pushed. It was development was taking longer, QA got squeezed, and so in those views, having an ability to drive down to your most at-risk T codes, identifying those T codes that um, where the change is concentrated, and that you absolutely need to focus your testing on, uh, is was important then, and today with the SAP customer trying to move to much more frequent release structures, sometimes known as agile release structures, uh, this becomes an even more important comment. Are you seeing that, Dave, in your client base?
It's a very interesting point. Having just got back from attending HP Discover last week, one of the key points that I got out of some of the dialogue that I had with SAP customers there is that there is this trend of again, agile across the enterprise, moving to DevOps methodologies and so forth, is putting a push to the SAP world as well to start doing things in a more efficient way, to stop looking at those projects as big monolithic entities and to try to start having more of a sprint-based model and a DevOps optimized way of doing things. And naturally, when we look at doing that in the optics of a big system like SAP, there's particularities involved in that. And not to mention that SAP itself is an environment that's ever changing, right? SAP is adding on net new interfaces. There's the HANA backend, which poses a certain level of risk, tons of power in there from an analytics perspective, but also something that you need to ensure that you're testing and you're testing all the right things around that. So I would have to say I'm as we've said in the past, Dave, I'm in violent agreement with that one. Absolutely.
I think the other thing that drives out importance in impact testing is the ability to really help your business user and the business area focus and understand where the majority of the changes are. And I'll just comment here very quickly and on a following slide. And this is the one kind of advertisement for IntelliCorp. We've done a lot of work independently. We've taken a lot of research that Google has done about how they predict where they should be testing in their applications or suite of applications, and we've applied that to the IntelliCorp impact analysis set of capabilities so that you get those same predictive models when you're talking about SAP testing. And Dave, I think if we combine the ability for risk-based testing, which is what is changing, and we overlay that with where are the majority of the changes occurring, we can begin to help a QA team and a process owner team really begin to focus their testing in areas that are relevant to the changes and that also reduce the amount of time they have to test because they're very focused on their testing. Are you also in violent agreement on that topic?
Yeah, I would say when you think about understanding what needs to be tested, that there's that whole combined factor of what's changing physically in the system, what we're using within that system, because SAP being the big core system that we deploy, it doesn't mean that we're using every single part of that in a critical fashion within our organization. So understanding that we're deploying transports into a system that is going to touch our SAP system, then understanding how we're using our system and how it correlates to the transports that are being applied and the tests that we have and the criticality of those things for us, it's when we triangulate all that information that we can actually come up with a subset of data which we can then use to fine-tune per the time that we have to test what we should be focusing on as far as tests. And I mean this in a way that, sure, we'd want to be able to test everything, but when it comes to these large systems, it's next to impossible to test everything. So we need to be realistic in the time that we have to establish a test, especially if we're moving to an agile DevOps model, and then basically realistically be able to go back to the business and to say, as a QA organization, we've run the analysis, we understand the impact to change physically in our system, we've correlated that to the criticality of the transactions that are running inside of that, and our recommendation is we test this. Now, it does leave a certain gap or margin of error, right? But it's what covers the most vast area and gets us to the timeline that we want. Then the business can make a decision to either push out the release, allocate more time or more resources to do the testing efficiently, or accept and understand that risk, which is something that often we don't have in the QA world. Often we've got I don't want to say a queasy feeling, but it sort of is that, where we feel like we don't have enough time and we'd like to justify the request for additional time or the request for additional resources to properly do testing. But what we're lacking often is the actual data to allow to go forward to the business and say, this is why we need it. This is a tangible data. These are the gaps. These are the things as to why we want to either have a bit more time or more resource, or that we feel comfortable with what we're going to deploy as far as testing within a certain margin. So yeah, again, in agreement.
Dave, that's a really interesting topic, because one of my clients specifically, the QA, the QA manager, was invariably in the position that change requests come in to development would make the change. They'd do whatever configuration changes, code changes needed. They would install the code in a transport going into queue, and the first time he knew about it was when the transports arrived in queue, and a one-line description of what the change did. He was able to change and therefore didn't have any idea how many resources he needed to test it, didn't have any idea what that time length would be, what all he needed to test, et cetera, and at the other side of the pipe was the business beating on him to release the change into production, because they were only concerned about the getting the change into production. He was able to change the structure so that he analyzed did an impact analysis while the code was still in dev, so he could understand relative to his queue system what the level of effort of testing, what the impact was, what the level of effort, and so he could go to management before and say, I need, if you want testing at a 90% level for this change, I need this level of resource to accomplish this in the amount of time that you've given us. So I think that is always a huge issue with all of the QA people that I've ever worked with, dealt with, just that understanding that I can get to a position where I have somewhat more control of my life.
Right. It's not about, really, it's about understanding that in SAP, when you look at a change in a specific area that the business is really concerned about, it's fine to test that. It's fine to understand what the business thinks in that area. But if we can actually produce the report rapidly that says, okay, I understand that we're deploying a change to this area and that's critical, but understand that in SAP, when you pull the string, that area is tied to a bunch of other areas in the back. So if you want to efficiently ensure that the change that we're doing there doesn't have a negative impact on all kinds of other functionalities within the business, because it's so interwoven, as you've seen that VA01 image that was produced earlier on. I mean, you change one area, there could be a lot of trickle-down effect to other systems. So understanding the paths that are impacted by the change allows us to really come back to the business early on, not in a reactive mode, but much more in a proactive mode, is to tell them, okay, these changes are critical to the business, we want to address them, but understand that if we want to do this in the most safe and efficient way possible, we need to cover these areas, and these areas entail spending a certain amount of time and resources to properly do it. And again, it's about having the information to be able to have that intelligent discussion and defend why we sort of need that time and efficiency. And that becomes all the more important to be able to do that in an automated fashion with a tool and technology to allow you to do it. I mean, you could achieve certain amount of that by going through OSS notes and digging around and understanding the impact of a transport and then the dependencies on other ones, and we've all sort of worked through that. It can become a headache, and it can be very time consuming to do it, and you can get some form of a report that's robust to a certain degree, but it's extremely time consuming. And if we're moving to an agile DevOps methodology and we're trying to get to a mode where we're deploying change into the system in a much more regular fashion to benefit from that, then we need to be able to get to that information much more rapidly and more efficiently.
Absolutely. And one of the, just one comment about the slide that's up, one of the most insidious areas of impact into an SAP environment, or actually there are two that I think everybody spends a lot of time around code and understanding code impacts, but changes to the IMG and the config tables, because SAP is a config-driven system, is one of the most insidious issues that kind of get past the appropriate level of testing, given that we don't really have good requirements, we don't really have good change documents to the requirements. So config changes and role and authorization changes are two of the areas that are often very insidious in terms of understanding what to test, how to test it, where to focus the testing, and good impact analysis tools will give you identification into impacted roles, impacted authorizations. I have one client that they I can't disclose the name of the client, but they make all kinds of recipes for people. They're a mass manufacturer of recipes, and one of the things that's critically important to them is that no one individual be able to see a complete recipe and procedures for that recipe, so that they can always protect that. When SAP is making changes to the standard roles and authorizations, that often impacts their roles and authorizations, and they could easily, without good impact and good testing, have a situation where they now enable somebody in their organization to see a complete recipe. As an example, for Colonel Sanders' fried chicken, and they could steal that recipe, which would be a huge monetary impact to the underlying company. So I just, I think as we think about this for our customers and for the folks on the call, understanding code, IMG impact, master data impact, and role and authorization impact is all a key part of that. And then being able to go look in your test asset database and identify those things. It's really great to identify the things where I have tests, but I think the bigger value is really where there are gaps and where I have no test. I mean, how many times in your experience have you seen the QA team or the business team did all the testing they knew and had, and there were still major incidents when new changes were pushed into SAP, Dave?
It's almost on a regular basis as far as that goes. Much more than most organizations would want, for sure.
So it's always a question. It's always for me, because I've worked both in the automation side of the business and in the impact side of the business, understanding. Okay, now we have a much better understanding of kind of the impact piece of the business, what we can identify, et cetera, et cetera. Let's talk, Dave, for a minute, if you will, because you're currently much more involved in the automation side than I am. Let's talk about automation.
Sure. So, Dave, I guess I'll let you sort of pass through these slides. So when we think about the challenges when it comes to testing in the SAP space, right? And in fact, I would say the SAP space, but even across all environments, we're always stuck with this, I guess, this triangle of elements where we got to find the right middle fit, right? We're asked basically to conduct testing in shortened time frames. We want to do that with less and less cost in the way that we do it, and we always want more and more quality to be delivered in. And the problem with that is that if we stay in a traditional model without deploying proper technology and tools to do that, it's next to impossible. There's no way for us to reduce time, if we're going to continue doing manual testing. There's no way for us to reduce cost and do things more efficiently without acquiring a proper set of technologies that'll gain the efficiencies that we want. And quality itself, I mean, if we want the quality to improve, we need to get better coverage. We need to make sure that we're testing the right things. So when we look at this, it's a combination of a bunch of different things that allow us to sort of grasp, to get control of that. It's a combination of best practices and having the right people in place. And then it's a combination of the right pieces of technology that give us the right level of information and assist us in doing things in a more efficient fashion. So when we talk about automation, Dave, if you want to move forward, if we talk about automation, there's a key amount of challenges that are within that world. And Dave, in our past lives, you and I, we tackled some of these. I've been actually in this space now for 20 years and tackling it for all kinds of different environments. A good part of that in the SAP space. And there's been a lot of approaches to address this challenge. And I must say that in my 20 years, my biggest pain and my biggest hurt, if you want, is I always ask myself, why aren't more organizations attaining the level of ROI, the theoretical ROI that exists behind deploying automation? Because it's very easy for anybody to understand. If I can automate a process that typically takes me a day and I can run it in a couple of hours and I can run this thing regularly, then the ROI is tangible. So why is it that not more organizations are attaining that value? Well, some of that is due to very inherent level of challenges that exist when we want to tackle automation. First of all is, the core technology. Most of the technologies out there are built on two models, either this record and replay approach, which, you got to run through each one of the different flows, and each flow is sort of path locked in what it does, to build that out. So it's easy to build, but limited in what it can deliver. Or you've got your traditional scripted approach, which fits in as well to this record and replay model, which requires you to go and program and code your different functions and build out different elements, which then adds this level of complexity of tests that need to be maintained. So, these approaches tend to fail because of the fundamental limitations on the way that they approach automation and the complexity that they deliver. The other element is the level of coverage, right? So, and this is compounded very much so when we look at testing systems like SAP, because of the complexity of the business transactions that are in there and the multitude of different paths that a core transaction can take. So for example, if we take a standard create sales order, what are the amounts of types of sales orders that we can deliver? And what are the variations of those? There are literally hundreds often that can happen there. So you want to be able to have a high degree of coverage, but the problem is if it's complex to build those, you fail in that ability to be able to do it. Dave, could you just go back one? You want to be able to keep those test cases updated, right? So the maintenance of those tests become a challenge as well, because if you build out a framework and you attain 20% coverage and then things start breaking on you, and then you got to basically start falling into a maintenance mode of those tests, and that's time consuming. I can tell you from experience that the vast majority of the organizations that I've gone into, very, very few organizations are able to get over the hump of 15 to 20% coverage of what matters to them from an automation perspective. Now, they'll say they're getting value out of automation, out of that, because they're able to run that 15, 20% and maintain it on a regular basis. However, in my books, if you really want to attain a high degree of ROI out of automation, you need to be able to break that barrier and attain 60, 70, 80% coverage from an automated fashion in something that you can actually maintain with a minimal team to be able to derive the type of ROI that you want out of the investment in this type of a technology. You need to be able to have a technology that allows you to keep your test cases up to date as it pertains to the data that feeds those tests, up to date as it pertains to the updates of those tests in relation to the changes that are happening in your system. And that basically means understanding that these elements are going to change in your system and they're going to impact these tests, so that prior to that change deployed into the system, you understand what it is that you need to update in your modular test case and test case scenarios to ensure that you have the proper coverage. And finally, as I mentioned, it's not just about product, it's about staffing, right? You need to have the right skill sets of individuals to be able to conduct the testing. And when we're talking about SAP testing, the problem is easy to understand, is that we rely on the business. We'll go get SMEs or subject matter experts out of our business to participate in the testing because of the complexity of all those different paths and the data. We need their expertise. And often these individuals, well, they're not coders and they're not scripters by nature, right? They're business level experts. So if we expose them to technology that's too complex, then they'll tend to fail. So Dave, anything you want to add to these 4 points?
Yeah, I was just thinking, Dave, the challenge that we always see when we're trying to do a massive automation project is the upfront cost, either to build the automation or to reuse the kind of pre-built automation. And what the combination of impact analysis and automation really gives us an ability to take that upfront cost and help management understand we are only building automation for those things in this project. And I say that because SAP in today's world, we only believe that we're going to be in business for the next quarter, it seems. And so every project has to stand on its own in its current release cycle and its current effort cycle. And by combining automation with impact analysis, we drive the automation around just those things that are impacted with this project and just these elements. And then if we do this over time, over 3, 4, 5 projects, we build up an automated test bed that is particularly relevant to how we use SAP as a client, where the changes are occurring, where the impact is occurring. And so it really begins to address and help deal with all of these various kinds of issues that we see in how, at the end of the day, how do you deliver an automated test bed that gives you a 70+% coverage on your SAP environment? So when you're doing a massive regression test, it's straightforward, simple, and easy to execute.
Absolutely. It's about testing what's meaningful and what matters, right? And what's meaningful and matters changes from an organization to another, and it changes as well from a project scope to a project scope. So combining the visibility that you get from the impact analysis to what you need to test and what you have and what you're missing is critical to be able to do that. So if we continue down this path, I mean, some other key points is the inefficiency of resources, right? So people who know the QA tools, I was basically alluding to this, that know the QA tools don't necessarily know the business, and the people that know the business are not often the people that are comfortable with QA tools. And that's why often when you look at automation in an organization, you'll usually find 1 or 2 people that sort of have that hybrid expertise and fit in that middle zone. They'll be the gatekeepers and the owners of automation, and they'll be the only ones that are really using it. And the problem with that is it's not scalable, right? So you need a technology that allows the expertise of each one of those types of users to be able to participate with their knowledge and expertise and to work towards the joint effort of building out that test bed. And finally, the cost of testing is becoming more and more. It's perceived as this necessary evil. It's one of my banes of this world is I've dedicated my career over the last 20 years to testing, and most organizations, they get I guess goosebumps on their skin when they hear about testing. It's not something that they want to hear about because it's just perceived as this money sink, right? Somewhere where we got to spend it, we got to do it. And I'm trying to change that and say it's not the case. If it's properly done, it actually is a tremendous investment and it'll derive tremendous ROI, right? It doesn't need to be just this perceived cost. It should be very easy to spend into this area because of what you're actually saving, the risk that you're mitigating, and so forth, and proper tools and proper best practices allow you to get there. End-to-end business processes can cross many platforms and applications. So yes, today we're talking about SAP, but let's face it, SAP, your core transactions, although SAP would probably want you to have everything running only in SAP, they don't for 99% of the organizations, if not 100. There is other systems that traverse that. You want to be able to create meaningful tests that traverse all those systems and allow you to test what matters to the business. It's not about testing an application, it's about testing the business processes across the multiple applications that are there, so that whenever change happens, you can release that into production and feel comfortable that it's not going to have impacting effects in a negative way to your production landscape. And then managing reporting, test plan, test history, compliance, challenging. So you got to make sure that there's proper integration and visibility so that you can produce the right level of reports, because let's face it, if we can test things but we can't pull up the value of what we're testing, it's irrelevant. We really need to be able to produce the right level of reports showing that we tested the right things, and be able to produce that to the business so that there's a level of comfort in what we're doing and the value that we're bringing. So those are the key automated testing challenges that I've perceived. Dave, anything you'd like to add?
I early on, I remember a conversation with Linda Hayes. For those of you who know her in the audience, actually for those of you who don't know her, she was one of the original test automation architects back in a long time ago. She built a tool, her company built a tool for load testing for SAP. She built a product that later became the core technology from our company today called Worksoft, a product called Certify. And Linda and I were talking about the notion that testing is really a tax on development resources, right? We could talk about quality as that thing which enables us to be very, very good at delivering the products that we deliver, but the reality is oftentimes management thinks about, if I could spend less on QA, I could spend more on development, I'd get more change work done, I'd have more value to the client. And so we often kind of put that on the table in the conversation and said, how, if you had a way to reduce your tax, if you will, your quality tax down to 5%, would you be interested? And there was not a single soul who didn't raise their hand. And then we were able to prove to them that that investment produced incremental value over time, particularly as we looked at the combination of impact analysis combined with automation and how you could lay that automation investment out over a period of time so that it was more easily chewable in today's budget. But it is a never-ending challenge, and one day that I think the combination of these sets of capabilities begin to deliver a solution that we haven't seen before.
Agreed. And in fact, it's I think over the years we've had many dialogues over a beer or a cup of coffee around these subjects, and looking at ways to tackle this problem. And the reality is that unless you have efficiency and understanding what's changing and efficiency then to tackle that change, it's very, very difficult to grasp or address this in a meaningful way without having an army of resources to be able to do it. So if an organization wants to take control of this, it's important to have automation around the discovery and the understanding of the impact, as well as the delivery of the testing, in an efficient way around that. So here's some statistics that come from the Eurostar community team from September of 2015, a query that was sent out around what are the top challenges faced as a tester. And as you know, Eurostar is equivalent to Star East, Star West over here, or Star Canada up over here. They're basically a grouping of test experts around the world, and it's conferences that take place on a yearly basis, bringing those communities together. And as you can see, the challenges, I think these are pretty much the same challenges that I would have been alluding to 10, 15, 20 years ago in my career. The problems is, the most compelling ones are resources, time, money, people, technology. Testing is expensive, it's costly, it's perceived as such as well by the organization. So it's very difficult, to justify investments in ROI because there's skepticism, right, in the ability to do this. So you want to be able to have a proved out technology that be able to address these things. And the other core concern that people have brought forward was maintainability of the tests, right? So building automation is one thing. There's nothing worse than investing a year and a half, 2 years to put together a framework in place, and the business goes back to analyze where it's at year and a half later and find out that most of it's fallen apart. It'll be very difficult once that's happened to justify another investment or effort into that. So it's important that when we do have the buy-in to do automation and to push forward with those elements, that we do all the right things and we deploy the right technologies and we put forward the right best practices to get to the point that we want, and that we get there in a maintainable fashion, right? There are multiple branches in a tree that will lead to failure when it comes to automation. There are paths that can get out there, and actually it's one of the reasons why I founded SQA Logic years ago, was to be able to assist organizations in paving the path, if you want, to success in these types of areas.
Dave, I see I realize we're kind of maybe getting a little short on time, but there's a question in that somebody asked, and I think it's particularly relevant at this time. So the question that's asked, do I have it correct? Not only can you identify what needs to be tested, but you can identify those test automation assets that need to be updated. That's yes is the answer. And how do we do that? The combination of impact analysis and the ability to reach over into the automated test bed and correlate, identify from a T-code, screen number, program number, ID characteristic we tie specifically to the asset that needs to be updated. And I hope that answers your question, because if you get that understanding, you get the essence of what Dave and I have been talking about today.
Very good question, by the way.
So hope that was a good answer. We are kind of running close to the end of the time. Dave, if you want to kind of tell me what you want to touch on.
Yeah, I think we're good. I think we're paced at the right level to wrap up on the hour as planned. So have you ever wondered why most companies never get past 15-20%? Well, I mean, again, why do people fail? It's because testing is time consuming. Automation often requires too much expertise and it's expensive, and you build things out and unfortunately they tend to fall apart. So you need to basically find something that you're going to be able to build and then have a facility to maintain, and also take automation and look at it in the optics of what your target audience is. Sure, I could build a framework for myself that I'll be able to use because I got 20 years of experience in building automated frameworks. However, if I hand that off to an organization who are planning to have business users maintain that after, I can almost guarantee that it's going to be a failure. So it's about putting the right tools into the right people's hands and understanding the audience in question. Next. So SAP, a greater challenge, okay? So SAP, when you think about it, there's a couple of core compounding elements that make it different. I'm going to go through some of these, but it's metadata based, so a single change, as I said, you can pull a string and it'll impact a multitude of different areas that you might not have thought of inside of the system. It's mission critical, right? It supports the most critical business processes of your organization. So there's reticence to change inside of these systems, and you got to make sure that any change that you do have won't have an impact because it'll impact your core business. So there's a lot of risk involved. It's very customizable, right? It's an environment that ties into a lot of other external systems, and it's highly customizable with the ins and outs of that system. So you got to make sure you're testing not just the core system, but the end-to-end processes that traverse that. And I guess the most important element is that change is constant. There are literally daily transports hitting most SAP systems that impact some form of change within there. So, and most organizations, when asked, they'll say that they don't necessarily feel they've got full control around that. So when you think about a solution from an automation perspective of testing these complex ERP, CRM systems, and you might recognize some of the phrases over here, what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to proactively understand the impact of transports on target systems. So you want to instantaneously understand that impact and be able to basically determine what are the key business functions that are impacted. You want to mitigate the risk by pinpointing those relevant test assets, identifying the gaps in coverage that you might have so you can rapidly build those. So automatically, or I can almost say automagically, determine what those are, and find what it is the things that you need to test, how you need to update them. You want to rapidly create and update your appropriate test sets and you want to be able to have that that technology accessible to your core user community, which in the ERP CRM space, let's face it, are SMEs and business users. It is not coders and scripters, so you want to be able to have the broadest audience available to use that, so rapidly create and update those tests, and you want to be able to efficiently validate the test assets that change before they go into production. So you want to be able to use a data-driven mechanism, something that allows you to drive the multiple paths through the application, leveraging the business user's knowledge of the data that's critical to run through those tests, so you can maximize your test coverage and do it with a minimal amount of test assets to maintain. And that's how you attain putting together a solution that's going to live within your organization for many, many years and derive a lot of value for you for a long, long time to come. So with that being
Dave,
said, we'd like to thank you.
yeah, and I see one more. We've got a couple of minutes. One more question in the chat. What's the time frame for implementation of this integrated impact analysis automation environment?
That's a good question, Dave. I mean, you know as well as I do, I'm a firm believer in these technologies. I think that they've derived a lot of value. I've actually deployed and worked with both of these organizations over the years, and there's a reason why I support them. It's because I've seen them deliver value within numerous customers. There's a difference between installing and deploying. I would say the installation is something that happens within a matter of a week or so, both for the IntelliCorp piece as well as the turnkey product. I would say that proper implementation and standing it up and where you're at the point where you have a fair degree of coverage and are getting value is literally a matter of weeks to a couple of months. So I would say typical project is anywhere between 6 to 12 weeks from an implementation perspective, and at that point there's a strong level of self-sufficiency within the organization and adoption and capability of reusing. And then with the minimal amount of mentorship and support going forward, I've seen organizations derive tremendous value out of this technology.
Yeah, and I think, Dave, the other important thing, really important thing, is in that 6 to 12 week time period, you get provable, definable return on investment. So you can go back to the guys who are providing the money and say, here's the specific return that we've delivered in this very short project window.
Oh,
So,
absolutely, absolutely.
you
I mean, the reality is, whenever I drive a project for customers, the number one thing is the first part of the project is always a place that people don't like, because it's the area where we gotta lift the cover and look at everything that's not pretty under there, and document it, because that's your today. It is what it is, and it needs to be documented so that when we go down the project of deploying the technology, that throughout that process, and most importantly when we wrap it up, that we can prove that we've attained the level of ROI that was there, that we've got the measurable metrics around that, and that we can then continue pushing forward and expanding into new areas and growing. And that's how within an organization you can implement the notion of a real testing center of excellence, deriving value across the business organizations and units.
So we're arriving at the end of the hour. Turnkey and audience, thank you from my perspective, for allowing Dave and I to share a bit of time with you today.
You bet, and I would like to thank both of you, David Millett from SQA Logic and David Pickrell from IntelliCorp. We appreciate your time and your expertise and your knowledge of the industry. We appreciate all of your time today. And for those of you on the phone, you will receive a recorded version of this webinar as well as the white paper. Don't hesitate to contact us. We can put you in touch with both Daves, either Dave at any point, and we can answer any of your questions as well. So visit turnkeysolutions.com and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.